You think about that. I want you to substitute USC for Florida State and Washington State for Wake Forest, something like that. You see down there at the bottom, Oregon and Washington were desired by the Big Ten, while Big 12 brands were not. What is up, everybody? It is Jake with Master Football back at it again. Happy Tuesday. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to be up to date on everything college football, pro football, Madden, EA college football, NFL draft, anything related to American football, hit the red subscribe button. You will not be disappointed. Also hit the like button too. And if you're on Twitter or X, hit the follow button. That fam is growing. Without further ado, let's get into the video. All right, guys, we are still mourning the decline of the Pac-12. Now, remember here, one thing that's really interesting, if it is a full-on collapse of the Pac-12, it would be extremely interesting because that hasn't happened in some time. I think about this situation here. A lot of people might say, oh, yeah, well, the Big East collapsed. The Big East is still around. It's just a basketball-only league. Oh, yeah, well, the WAC collapsed. The WAC is still around. It's just a basketball-only league. And again, they are trying to form kind of a football contingency there. But thinking about that, with all of the money still tied up in Pac-12 agreements and this and that, again, the teams that left won't be accessing those dollars, but the Pac-12 may be. So I think that, again, it's still probably going to be around. But it's really interesting to see that because you think about the ACC, and the ACC is an extremely weird situation. I'm going to draw a scenario that basically shows how the ACC is better watch its back, is what I'm going to say here, because there's several wolves on the outside that are looking to feast on it, that it doesn't, and I don't think it's ready for that feasting. And one thing that's really interesting about the Pac-12, this was one of the most interesting things about this whole situation, was the fact that it said right here, Brett McMurphy, how committed was the Pac-12 to staying together? Remember here that Arizona State, Utah, they did not want to leave the Pac-12. Following last Tuesday's meeting with Commissioner George Kliavkoff, a Pac-12 president contacted a Big 12 president and asked if the Big 12, quote, could take all 9 of us except for Oregon State and Washington State, which is absolutely shocking. Thinking about that, so basically take 7 of them. That's the situation he was talking about there. So that's how committed they were. They want to drop Oregon State, Washington State for some reason. Washington State's actually a really watched brand. It doesn't really make a lot of sense there, but again, they were committed to doing that. However, 2 of the remaining Pac-4 members, Stanford and Cal, look like they might have a solution out of this whole situation. And the sources here from Pete Thamel, ACC to begin discussing a Cal and Stanford as additions. And I know what a lot of you are saying. Cal and Stanford, what the hell kind of additions are those? Cal has not been relevant in football in a long time. Stanford was, but they've really fallen off. They don't really necessarily push themselves in football as much as they should. Think about this, though. One of the big drivers here, presidents really like Cal and Stanford because being in the same room as Cal and Stanford, 2 world-renowned universities, like we said before in one of my videos, they're 2 of the top 10 world universities. So adding them in would be valuable. And you think about that, California flying to Louisville, Kentucky. It's a bit weird, but it's a situation they were thinking about. Remember before, we almost had a Pac and a ACC merger before, but ultimately they decided to kind of chop that league up individually. It says here, ACC leaders are set to begin exploratory discussions on the potential additions of Cal and Stanford to the conference, sources told ESPN on Monday. Sources caution that the 2 scheduled discussions are only in the embryonic stages, one call slated with ACC athletic directors and a separate call with the league's presidents that will play out Monday and Tuesday. I'm going to tell you right now, the presidents were going to be much more positive about that merger than the athletic directors, but again, the presidents win. With the Pac-12 shut down to 4 schools after the defection of 5 universities on Friday, with 4 remaining schools, including Cal and Stanford, are scrambling to find places to land. Both have elite academic reputations, and Stanford consistently has the country's best top-to-bottom athletic department, but the reverberations of realignment have left them at a crossroads. And again, somebody says here, it's complicated. There's significant travel expense. I think it's going to be all over the board with both ADs and the presidents and what they may want to do. Cal and Stanford would likely have to have a reduced share. Eventually, though, they're going to want to become a full share. We see here the fact they mentioned that the ACC is locked into a television deal with ESPN through 2036. So congratulations to Cal and Stanford in that situation. They are at least being considered for some of those things. Remember my video last week absolutely blew up for me. Again, I'm a smaller YouTuber here. Blew up for me talking about Oregon State and Washington State, how I felt like they were going to be left out. As a matter of fact, those conversations were being had behind their back that Oregon State and Washington State were going to be kicked out. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense. It's conference realignment. No, there's a lot of things. For the most part, a bigger brand makes sense, but those mid-tier brands, people get a little picky. There's Oregon State, a real big draw. Washington State is, but does the market what you want? Whatever the stuff that's going on there, they decided ultimately to kind of go that own direction. Remember, the Pac-4 now has two teams. Two want to go to the ACC, and two want to be in the Pac-12, aka the Pac-12 of two teams. I would caution Cal and Stanford in this instance right now because for multiple reasons here, we have to go over something. And again, a video that I made yesterday, that posted yesterday, it was very important, talking about reasons why the Big 12 won the war with the Pac-12. This was a big one right here. Check out this one slide. So one contributing factor to the reason why the Big 12 won the war with the Pac-12, one of the biggest reasons was because the Big 12 or the Pac-12 didn't think they were at war, and unfortunately they were. The Big 12 read the tea leaves and kind of saw that whole situation. Brett Yormark did a really good job of working themselves through that. But one of the big things that hurt the Pac-12 compared to the Big 12 was the Pac-12 had a high disparity in value in brands. Pac-12 used to have a tiered payment systems, USC higher, Washington State lower, and then the conference switched to an even tiered pay system and aimed at parity for the league. Joel Klatt referred that in one of his videos there. You think about that. I want you to substitute USC for Florida State and Washington State for Wake Forest, something like that. You see down there at the bottom, Oregon and Washington were desired by the Big 10, while Big 12 brands were not. Remember here, the same situation is happening because remember, Florida State wants out because they see this disparity too. This was a report that came out just a few days ago, how the rest of the ACC is reacting to Florida State's unhappiness. Don't get me wrong. Florida State sees what's happening here, and they are trying to address it. As Florida State President Richard McCullough began his remarks to his board of trustees during a virtual meeting on Wednesday, more than 2,000 people were tuned into the live stream on YouTube. Among those were officials in both the ACC office and schools across the league. Shortly after, McCullough told the board that Florida State would very seriously consider leaving the ACC unless there is a radical change to the conference's revenue distribution model. The backlash from those inside the league followed. He says, while Florida State has made it clear that it had been unhappy before, this was the first time McCullough said so publicly, the strongest sign yet that Florida State would consider leaving the league. And again, a thing here to remember is the fact that the league has a grant of rights through 2036. It looks like it's ironclad, but we saw that it was ironclad with Oklahoma and Texas. They negotiated a year out of the Big 12. We see the fact that USC and UCLA went to the Big 10. These things can be negotiated for the right amount of change, if you know what I mean here. But you see the fact that he's talking about that. You're like, okay, well, is Florida State really that much more valuable? Or they're just being arrogant? Why would they deserve a greater share than the other teams? It's because basically it's Florida State, Clemson, and then everybody else. If you look at the TV viewership, and as the average viewer, Florida State averages 70% more viewers than the ACC average. Going through this here, Florida State easy at the top, number one. Clemson a little bit behind them, number two. A big jump to Miami, but again, Miami's still a valuable brand. And then Louisville, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Georgia Tech, Virginia, Pitt, North Carolina State, and then we got North Carolina, and then we have Boston College. Wake Forest isn't even on there. But thinking about the situation there, you see the fact that there's a giant discrepancy between these two brands here. Remember what I said before, a huge discrepancy between the Pac-12 members in terms of Washington State, in terms of Oregon and Oregon State, considering the fact that Oregon State and Washington State are no longer in the plans for any other conference other than the Pac-12, aka four members right now. Whereas Oregon and Washington are in the Big Ten, the highest paid conference in college football. Look at this. This is going to happen to the ACC at some point. And again, the members that we've heard before, Florida State, Clemson, we've also heard Miami, who is now an AAU member. We've also heard North Carolina, an AAU member. Virginia as well, although Virginia's been coming here and there, but we check through the ACC to kind of see what's happening here because I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. So looking at these brands here, the way that if I go through this in alphabetical order, more than likely what I think is going to happen here is Boston College seems like they are going to be a Big 12 team if the league is cannibalized, and I think it will be. Boston College seems like it's a Big 12 team, kind of a scrap left over. Clemson seemed like they're going to be a Big 10 or an SEC team. The SEC already has a presence in South Carolina. Wouldn't be surprised if the Big 10 trying to, again, I don't know if the SEC knows that they're at war with the Big 10. The Big 10 knows they're at war with the SEC. So I think that Clemson probably would be an SEC team. Duke seems like a Big 12 brand, potentially one that gets left out. I go back and forth between this. I do know that Brett Yormark has been really strong in making sure that he has basketball brands in the Big 12. One thing that's doing is making sure that whatever the future is of college sports, there's two revenue sports in college football or in college sports for sure. Easily number one is football. Number two is basketball. And the Big 12 has basically said, okay, so we're not going to be as strong in football, but if you don't include us in basketball, you're missing out on some of the biggest brands in the country. Arizona, Houston, Kansas, Baylor, some of the biggest brands in that league. Wouldn't be surprised if Duke is cannibalized by the Big 12 when something like that happens. Florida State seems like they're a Big 10 team. They want to be a Big 10 team. Georgia Tech, I go back and forth between. Georgia Tech is an AAU institution. It's in Atlanta. Are they good at sports? No. They added Rutgers before. So adding Georgia Tech adds it. I don't know how much it adds Atlanta there, but it's something to consider. Louisville seems like a Big 12 team for sure. Miami seems like they would be a Big 10 team as well. Again, AAU status. North Carolina State, I know that North Carolina is wanted by the SEC. They don't have a presence in North Carolina. It's an obvious addition. They would go there. North Carolina State depends on how many teams the SEC would want. If they don't want them, I see the Big 12 team. If they do want them, then they would go to the SEC. Pitt, unfortunately, is in a weird spot. Pitt is already in an oversaturated Big 10 market. The SEC could take a chance. An AAU member increases the status of the league from an education perspective here. However, I don't really know, man. I mean, Pitt, we'll see how valuable of a brand they are. They're an important brand in college football, but probably seems like a Big 12 team to me as well. Big 12 as well for Syracuse. Virginia is an SEC team just for this fact of getting a presence out there. I know you saw that Missouri was added. Missouri is a weird addition. I don't really know how much it necessarily adds for them, but Virginia, I think, would. Virginia Tech, and the same thing with Virginia Tech and NC State are kind of like, hey, you want their rival? What are you thinking here? I don't really know how they add in there. I do know that Virginia Tech and Tennessee, they played at a Bristol Motor Speedway in a bowl game recently, or a preseason game, or a regular season game, early season non-conference, excuse me. So it would be a pretty easy geographical integration, which the SEC is more inclined to do. And then you look about Wake Forest. And Wake Forest, I think, is kind of stuck. They'll basically just say, look at Duke and be like, wherever you guys go, we will go. That's what I think is going to happen here. It's really interesting to see that because it seems like the Big Ten and the SEC are going to get in the battle for some of these top teams. The Big 12 would cannibalize who's left over. I think the ACC is at risk of heading the same way as the Pac-12. Huge disparity in brands in the ACC. We saw the same thing with the Pac-12. We're seeing the same thing in the ACC. There's a reason why Florida State's like, well, we don't like this, even the payment distribution. A big reason why that with 2036 negotiated deal that they're locked into, they want to get out of as fast as possible. Could we see movement by August 15th of this year? Potentially, man. But I do know that the chips are flying, and I know that Florida State, Miami, and a couple of those other teams are probably thinking to themselves, the Big Ten will add more teams, but at some point that might be oversaturated. We need to get there as soon as possible. Although the threats kind of have fallen away. You could say maybe that Stanford and Cal are a threat, although they're talking about going to the ACC too. It's just a really weird situation with everything connected here. I think that what's going to happen, ACC is going to get plundered. Top teams go to the SEC and the Big Ten. The mid teams go to the Big 12. And unfortunately, we're going to lose, not only more than likely lose the ACC, we're also probably going to lose the Pac-12 at some point. All right, guys, get in the comments right now. Let me know what you think about this whole situation. If the ACC goes the way of the Pac-12, a.k.a. 4, do they retroactively add members? Do they add East Carolina, something like that, to get their numbers up? Again, we're the same situation here. The ACC still has those brands. Whenever you have a conference, it still retains the performance of the previous years of the conference in terms of payments. So getting rid of a brand really doesn't make a lot of sense. Do you see it happening, though? You guys get in the comments and let me know. All right, guys, that's it. Thank you so much for being here. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. I really appreciate it. And follow me on Twitter/X. Twitter X fam is growing. I'll see you guys later. I am out.